Was a textile so polarizing yet so old that we've used it for thousands of years before textiles like cotton? That textile is leather. You see, humans have been wearing clothing for roughly 100,000 years according to the archaeological record, and leather has been in use for roughly about 40,000 years. The first articles of clothing were directly created from plant and animal sources. Fabric and textiles as we knew them didn't really come to exist until much later. But one thing has been known to be universal. Every civilization has worn garments made of animal skin. In the modern era, leather is the one textile that still links the most remote tribes in the world to the Paris couture runways. Leather embodies sensuality while demonstrating toughness. It carries an earthly essence that has titillated the minds of fashion designers, artists, fetishists, and even celebrities alike. It has opened our mind to the use of other materials such as PVC and latex for fashion and fetish purposes. In the leather community, the wearing of leather takes on a more nuanced and different meaning than just merely fashion. Even a culture has been built around the textile, which has embodied survival, resistance, and a larger cultural commentary. For us, it started as a language of survival. Hello, everybody. My name is Ivan Francis Wilbanks, and I'm an attorney who has studied fashion history and also loves to provide fashion commentary. So, if you like what we're doing, please hit that like and subscribe button. And today, we're going to be tracing the journey from 1940s motorcycle clubs, the 1970s representation in media, to today's fetish core that is often displayed by Vivenne Westwood's designs or Ludovic Saint-Cern's preview at, the New York Fashion Week in 2024, and Beyonce's Cowboy Carter. So, get a cup of water, get a cup of tea, or something and stronger, and let's just get into it. We have World War II to thank for modern inventions that make modern fashion possible, such as synthetic textiles and also the special industrial advancements. But World War II is also where modern leather and fetish culture really begins. How is this the case? Well, in the 1940s, queer veterans returning from World War II felt alienated from civilian life. They used fashion as a way to provide themselves cover. These GIs adopted surplus, military surplus specifically, such as bomber jackets, caps, boots, as a form of protective identity. Particularly gay and bisexual men who were returning from war were still wishing to embody a strong masculinity that being a soldier did. And as a result, certain styles, such as side caps, such as the one I'm wearing, or leather biker jackets, chaps, Levi's denim, and boots, became the style for many. The intentional use of military fashion provided a very masculine presentation to shield themselves from being known as homosexual at the time, which carried a lot of social penalties. It carried implications as far as a person's social status and their legal status. At that time, it meant being jailed, institutionalized, or even lobotomized. And it wasn't until after the 1940s where leather would begin to start being used as a fashion statement to demonstrate cultural alliance, resistance, and even artistic expression. Prior to this point, leather was used really for bags and shoes, and it was consistently used because of its durability and ability to craft it into different shapes and sizes. But with the rise of biker culture in the 50s, the material began to be used more for jackets, riding pants, chaps, caps, and other items. Leather was a second skin for bikers. It was used as a way to protect them from the physical elements of the wind and rain while riding, but it also provided a level of social protection as motorcycle gangs and groups began to form. The 1953 film The Wild One provided a visual template for many the world over. Marlo Brando served as the earliest stylistic archetype for men styled with the leather jacket, belt, denim, and boots. For the post-war gay community, the film provided a style that served two functions, using hypermasculinity as a safe harbor from the outside world, while providing themselves the space to be free from detection. For women in the 1950s, they had their own fashion influence that would also play on sensuality and open sexuality with a lens towards fetishism, leather, and BDSM. Betty Page in her early career was a pinup model who arguably helped to begin the sexual revolution of the 1960s. Betty Page helped to create the cone bra craze of the 1950s, also while being photographed while wearing high heels, lingerie, and holding certain implements. However, this sensual archetype became the classic and one that we would still see gracing the runways nearly 70 years later. Page's fashion sense also made way for showing more skin, which turned the status quo on its head from the very conservative styles of the 1940s and 1950s. No longer was it taboo for a woman to show any skin beyond the ankle or the wrist. Into the 1960s, as hemlines rose, women began to diversify and explore womanhood with more than one lens. And in fact, the entire world, fashion, and the leather community was also beginning to change. The 1960s birthed an age of subcultures and countercultures. Conformity of the 1950s began to become rejected as time passed. In the UK, punk and mod cultures began to develop in the bowels of London by the early 1960s. In the US, hippie culture began to bloom as the sexual revolution took off. During this time, leather and the fetish community began to develop an identity that would later become known the world over. Beginning in the 1960s, the Leatherman archetype was developed by artist Tom of Finland, also known as Toklu Laksonen. His illustrations standardized the Leatherman look. He designed the aspirational hypermasculinity that influenced real-world tailoring, exaggerated shoulders, chiseled and cinched waists. And see, Toko Larson featured men in military and biker gear as well as leather uniforms that were closely tailored to the body, which left absolutely nothing to the imagination, to the point that it appeared like a second skin. Often, these images invoked a strong sense of overt sexuality that many could find and deem obscene. But that wasn't necessarily the issue, and it really popularized leather culture from that point forward. And this shift helped to really change the cultural conversation. Leather wasn't just for protection anymore. It was chosen for its sensory qualities, its smell, its texture, and its ability to conform to the body, like a second skin. But it was also chosen due to its ability to invoke a strength and an innate sensuality that allowed the wearer to have their mind run wild. Altogether, this began to shape fashion both in and out of leather as society carried out of the 1960s and into the 1970s. It is also around this time that color began to take on a language of its own. The hanky code and the rise of specific gear like vests, chaps, and caps as a visual language to communicate sexual preferences or power dynamics without words became more common. Originally developed in response to sodomy laws in the 1960s, by the 1970s, the hanky code had turned into its own language. Every color flag determined a type of sexual activity sought, and the side that it was flagged on indicated who would take the dominant role or who opted for the submissive role with that specific activity. This system is still really largely used today in a lot of cruising culture, and it has been expanded upon and now feature different patterns and materials, which are indicative of the broadening fashionable expression within the leather and fetish community itself. As the 1970s rolled in, punk and rock and roll brought leather rebellion to the masses. The Ramones, Joan Jett, and the Sex Pistols adopted leather fashion and biker styles and the hardcore grit that it embodied. Suddenly, what had been seen as an underground thing had become in vogue as the cultural upheaval of the 1970s shifted the cultural zeitgeist. By the 1970s, leather gear also no longer was just merely clothing because there was now a coded understanding for each of these items and the necessity or the utility that each of them had. In the leather and fetish community, design has to meet function. So a harness has to hold, a collar must signify, cuffs have to be able to restrain. The utilitarian necessity led to high standards of craftsmanship and also durability that later defined what is considered to be luxury leather. So, for instance, harnesses, they began to appear in leather bars sometime between 1972 and 1976, with the first example of a taste of leather in San Francisco, including it in their catalog in 1972. Leather pants, boots, and chaps became more stylized, with additional options for embellishments and metal detailings being added, such as studs and spikes, with early examples being seen in the 1970s. Gauntlets and cuffs also began to appear as derivatives of leather gloves and were signifiers of a person's rank or seniority in the leather community. So they would normally signify a person as a daddy or a sir, as opposed to somebody necessarily just being a master. Normally, before someone would get a cover, they would usually get the gauntlets or the cuffs first. Collars, on the other hand, and their origins were a little bit more obscure just based on the research that I did. And while they were used to denote a person's submissive status or ownership in a leather dynamic, the earliest examples were from the 70s, but a lot of the scholarship starts in the 1990s. So this is Editing Ivan, and I actually have learned more since filming this video. So there are actually some sources from the 1950s and some other stories that actually could explain how collars came to be. But that's for a different video. So, toodles. So strangely enough, there is a little bit of a gap there. But There is noted to be that there were punks in the nightlife of London and bikers in the nightlife of Los Angeles and New York that were wearing them. And it was no longer seen as a subculture in the 70s for both of these groups to inhabit these spaces because it began to help build a global identity. Suddenly, the high fashion, it picked up the look and the essence of leather and the fetish community, and Vivenne Westwood ended up walking with it so that Versace, Jean Paul Gaultier, and Helmut Lang could end up running with it. How is Vivenne Westwood the source of the first major BDSM and high fashion collaboration? Well, Vivenne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren were pioneers in bringing fetish wear to the mainstream. They collaborated with fetish and leather manufacturers and retailers in the 1970s for the creation of her sex boutique. In about 1973, Vivenne Westwood was working with leather craftsman Alan Selby, otherwise and now known as Mr. S. Westwood had become well known in the 1970s punk and leather community in London for her designs and her artistry, while McLaren had started working with the London Leatherman, a leather retailer, in 1972. Now, Vivenne was then working with Alan Selby, who was providing leather bustiers to her fashion house, and Alan Selby actually was being supplied from the London Leatherman at that time as well. So, Vivenne Westwood thought it then to collaborate, ultimately culminating in the historic opening of the Sex Boutique in Chelsea, London in 1974. The boutique specialized in leather and fetish clothing and was a staple for the punk community until it closed in 1976. In 1978, she then put the community into the mainstream even further by printing a white t-shirt featuring a leather face mask for widespread circulation. This printing of this shirt garnered wide-scale attention in both the art and the fashion world. And although, after that point, Selby and Westwood had later went on to have their separate paths, Selby had went on to create Mr. S. Leather in San Francisco, opening in 1979, which is still currently open and selling products. Vivenne Westwood also became a name in her own right and became a staple recognized in the punk and leather fetish and fashion communities. And she also became a world-renowned designer, even doing other avant-garde and artistically inspiring designs up until her passing in 2022. And as far as London Leatherman, it still exists today. But because of Vivenne Westwood's push and her legacy, it changed the entire game. Gianni Versace said in March 1992, "Last night there were 200 socialites in bondage." This statement from the New York Times captured Versace's sentiment when he showed his radical Miss S&M Fall-Winter 1992 collection. The collection featured models in leather harnesses, corsets, and latex, and with 84 looks in the show, walked by the modeling greats Naomi Campbell and Linda Evangelista, along with so many more. This show really changed the game. The show featured many outfits that were made of completely black leather. There were harness-style constructions on the tops. Some looks featured leather chokers and collars, and various other elements that made the leather and fetish influence unmistakable. Now, the show caused controversy for many, as some deemed the elements obscene or profane, but this collection also held acclaim worldwide. It popularized leather and fetish fashion, making fetish wear edgy, rather than a sidebar mention of the leather and fetish communities. And the leather looks from this collection also evoked a sense of sexiness, elegance, and danger that many yearned for in an era where sexual repression was rife post the HIV/AIDS epidemic that kicked off in the 1980s. 33 years later, many of these pieces from this collection are still highly sought after and are sometimes called from the catalog by the likes of Miley Cyrus and Lady Gaga. Another designer that broke the rules is Jean Paul Gaultier. By 1990, it was well known that he could incorporate bondage and PVC elements into haute couture, and he famously designed Madonna's cone bra and the strap-adorned outfits for her 1990 Blonde Ambition tour. His legacy still lives on for this type of design in the movie The Fifth Element, which is one of my favorites. And for that movie, he designed over 1,000 costumes. While he was nominated for a Caesar Award in 1998, he finally won the 2020 Best Award for Costume Design in 2018, some 21 years after the movie's release. Particularly, the character Lilu Multipass's white strappy outfit is reminiscent of a segwifix, which is a popular bondage implement used in the fetish community. and also the heavy incorporation of PVC and rubber and the use of provocative cutting techniques in the construction of clothing hailed immense acclaim. His 1995 show for the fall showcased how deep this leather inspiration ran as well. This show featured 108 looks, with the first 20 showing a clear leather and BDSM influence. But PVC and rubber were also distributed throughout the entirety of the collection. Gaultier, in his numerous interviews, clarified why he wanted to push the envelope, stating, similar to leather culture, it was to break the rules and push the boundaries to invoke cultural commentary about repression. Then Thierry Mugler entered the conversation, as he designed with inspiration from the fetish community. But rather than his medium being leather, he opted for latex instead. Beginning in 1988 with the She Devils collection, Mugler showcased sexiness, but did it with a face-forward approach. Some of the looks featured latex, and one look was made entirely out of latex, consisting of a skirt suit with a jacket and the skirt itself. For fall-winter 1995, his collection showcased tons of looks featuring catsuits, bustiers, heels, and blouses entirely fashioned out of black latex. But this show also features the iconic robotic looks that have been worn by the likes of Zendaya and Beyonce. Overall, fall-winter 1995 shifted the cultural mindset regarding fetish fashion well into the 2000s and 2010s. It helped to shape the fetishcore dressing of the late 1990s, which also helped to inspire many looks in the Matrix trilogy. Certain fashion houses also got in the action too. Gucci, under the direction of Alessandro Michele, showcased his leather and fetish inspiration for fall-winter 2019-2020 and spring-summer 2020. Alessandro Michele, for his first look in the fall 2019 collection, featured a spiky mask and collar with spikes continuing on the blazer. And throughout the show, there were spiked masks and collars worn throughout with various different looks. Due to the increased visibility of leather and fetish clothing in the mainstream fashion community, celebrities also have changed the tide as well. 15 years ago, Lady Gaga met Queen Elizabeth II in 2009, and she didn't wear a dress from a Parisian runway. Oh, no. Instead, she wore an all-red latex gown by Atsuko Kudo. Atsuko Kudo had been making custom latex garments from her London couture house since 2001, and while many were surprised at the choice, the dress was sensible because it covered all areas of the body that were in line with appropriate royal protocol. And the queen herself, she didn't seem to be upset by it. Beyonce also put on some latex from Busted Brand Latex when she performed and promoted her Cowboy Carter tour back in 2025. This red, white, and blue look was custom made specifically for her. But Busted Brand is a favorite of multiple different performers such as Chappell Ronan. And again, Busted Brand is well known because of the fact that they are known for their provocative designs. However, there are still a couple of other questions that still linger on the minds of leather people and fetishists alike, as well as those in the fashion community. The question that often is posed is that, is there an appropriation of leather and fetish culture? And does fetishcore dilute the original meaning of the gear in the community? The second question is about the sustainability of these materials, because as we push towards sustainability, use of leather and animal fabrics are less and less popular. But lab-grown leathers may be the new frontier, and the use of latex also may be something that is going to be considered more in the future. And lastly is the thought and the process and the notion of whether or not leather and fetish design will continue to remain as a testament to the community's resilience, or is it going to be something that is commandeered for the likes of fashion sensationalism? But we're going to explore that more in part 2. So, if you liked everything that you heard, thank you for joining me today to talk about leather, fetish, and fashion. And again, if you like what you heard, drop a like, drop a comment, and I hope to see you in the next video. So long.